All right, Diedrich Muhammad joins us once again, Columbia, Maryland representative. Let's get that part straight.
Yes.
He's the chief of organizing policy and equity at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC, who have published a new report that we are going to get into here for a few minutes this morning. Columbia at 55, creeping segregation and lack of affordable housing threatens a legacy of Black-white integration. So, Diedrich, again, welcome to the program, and let's get your initial thumbnail or whatever summary of what this report is saying, and then let's talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I'm glad I can get you guys focused on what's really important for Black radical politics, studying Columbia versus discussions about Malcolm X and Tamika Mallory. So
we don't need all that nonsense. It's the realness.
So Columbia, Maryland, for most people would have no idea what that is. I guess people watch the show. Jared's talked about it for a while, but a suburb in between Baltimore and DC, much closer to Baltimore, created around 1967. And it was interesting in that it was one of the first planned communities, I think two in that time period, that wasn't designed to be racially segregated, meaning keep non-white people out. And so, it's been around 55 years. Interest, the Boondocks, the popular comic strip and television show, Aaron Magruder was based off of that. And I went to high school with him, and kind of a lot of the jokes about this attempt to have something that was designed to be more racially integrated meaning Black and white at that time period. I think there were some interesting learnings. I think why this is interest of me, not just because I live here, but of someone who does community economic development nationwide, is what effects can intentionality have in creating opportunity when you're in a larger society that is so dominated by race, class, capitalism, what have you, what can be done. And I do think Columbia showed some interesting things in an intentionality to build mixed housing, right? Making sure original Columbia, old Columbia, had apartments, townhomes, single family homes, all in the same area, had much public access, public lands, which made it very, people enjoyed that a lot. It made it a very successful suburb. But then as the success occurred, more people just moved to Columbia to be part of a successful suburb. And you started having, particularly in the last couple of villages, much less mixed housing in terms of townhomes, single family homes, and apartments. And so now in the most recent village, River Hill, I think the median value for a home is $700,000, and they only have maybe 9% apartments versus the original spots like Wall Lake and Town Center that had like 50, 70%, no, 50, 40 something percent apartments. And so you can see kind of just over time, even with, and the way that Columbia could even be as successful as it was originally was because it had total control, right? Like the Rouse Corporation is a corporate town. Like they bought the land, no one knew what they were doing. There was no real democratic systems to oversee Columbia. Columbia is weird in that it's the second biggest city in Maryland, but it doesn't have a mayor or anything like that. It has more of an association that used to be run by a company, and now that's more run by kind of a housing association. But the strict control allowed them to go in a particular direction. But as that weakened over time, we kind of allowed general American segregation by income and class to continue. Just the one other point I'll note is one thing I didn't realize, becoming more clear to me, is that the original design of Columbia was to have kind of middle or higher middle income and high income. It was never designed to really have low income, right? And so in some ways, you actually might have more low income housing in Columbia now than you did when it started. It's just you have such ridiculously high income housing that overall median home values, median income in Columbia has gone up very high. So I think that's
even for Black people, which I thought was fascinating too in this report. But there's a lot of things. So first of all, I do need to apologize to you and remind my co-host that in about 30 minutes, I do have to step out for about 10 minutes or so for a virtual doctor's appointment. So I apologize, and I'll rejoin the conversation shortly. But one thing I did want to start off with is, before we get into anything else, is just the subtitle of the piece. creeping segregation and a lack of affordable housing threatens a legacy of Black-white integration. And I did want to ask you, I thought you'd be a good person to ask of this, not only because you're a co-author of the report, but the assumption that Black-white integration is a good thing, as the title suggests. Could you say a word or two about what is it a good thing? Why is it automatically taken as a good thing that this notion of integration?
Yeah, and I would, personally, I'm much more for desegregation than necessarily any type of pushed integration. You will see that in reports I write in my professional job, it all doesn't reflect 100% my politics, obviously, right? Because who pays me to reflect my politics, right? So there is some changing of things in this, and I think that does go. I think it's real. I think the title really gets more toward the kind of mythology of Colombia. Colombia is this great place that's like multiracial and multi-class, and it's integrated. And that was like this positive spin. And now people are kind of like, oh, well, there's, when I was in school, it was like, oh, there's a black table. Is that bad? You know what I mean? Ignoring the non-white tables, right? But, there's a black table. And then now that, and one of the interesting things I found with Colombia was that I've been impressed that the black population has been continue to grow. I would have thought that even in terms of percentages, that now it's almost 30% of Colombia. It started off at about 8 or 9%. So even with the increase in cost of housing and stuff like that, Colombia has been a place where the black population has increased. And I've been just kind of shocked to find, maybe I haven't paid enough attention to the public schools, that no school in Colombia is even majority white anymore. And that's just a very big change from where I was. Now you're seeing kind of classic racial, socioeconomic segregation, and there's a real distinction. There's like 8 high schools, and there's 4 that's majority Black Latino, and there's 4 that's majority Asian and white, right? And all the economics that goes with that. So you see these divisions, and you're seeing understandings of like inner city Colombia, right, which is where Blacks are, and maybe growing Latino population. But yeah, so I think,
and that was the one thing I didn't. I hope I didn't. Maybe I missed it, but there was one thing. That was the one thing I didn't see in your report that has been reported elsewhere. That within Howard County schools, not specific to Columbia per se, but within Howard County generally, the segregation occurs at the level of AP or GT, whatever they are, AP classes. So everybody might go into the building, but the classrooms become wildly segregated, as Black students are almost never in these elevated courses. And that does create social distance and dislocation, even as everybody is physically walking into the same building. So it's kind of, to me, Columbia has always been kind of slick with what it claims it's going to be and how it's able to actually deal with the context of the world in which we live. So one point I just wanted to, you mentioned it, and I thought it was an interesting point that the study does account for, is that African Americans in Colombia have over twice the household income of African Americans nationally, which I automatically assumed was an extension of the gentrification that's happening, as Black families are pushed out of DC and Baltimore. Those with relative means can stay in PG County or Montgomery County. Those with a little more means come farther out here to Columbia and end up on the soccer field, where I overhear them on the sidelines lamenting all the hood Negroes that are seemingly following them out to Columbia. So like this is wild class thing that anyway, so go ahead. I just said a lot, but go ahead.
No. I mean, but there always has been, right? Like I remember hearing, family friends, talking, when we're all kind of, all Black situation, talking about, man, I used to remember, they're talking to other Black people about how they remember when they used to not see another Black person for a few days, and now they see one every day. And like, this was like in the 80s. And I'm like, and you're complaining about this to Black people, right? So there's always this kind of, interclass tension or contradiction or what have you. But I do want to note, median Black income is twice that of in Colombia of Blacks nationwide, but it's still 92,000, right? So I just want to be clear, it's not like people are necessarily balling out in Colombia,
right? It's just relative,
that's two people making 45,000, right? So again, I think
Yeah, that's
I
deep.
think this is the challenge. People don't understand how people really live throughout the country, right? Like the median household income in the U.S. for blacks is 45,000. So, like,
Wow.
most people are going on the
Household
street.
income, not individual. That's household
That's
income.
household income. That's not individual, right? And so that's how the median of black households are surviving. So yes, Columbia, and two, it's important to recognize Maryland is the highest income state in the country, and Howard County, which is where Columbia is located, is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, right? But yet still, there's this thing about we can't send our kids to Columbia public schools because they're too hood, right? Like, and hood just means just black people, because like it's not like there's shootings and all this type of stuff in the schools like that. I mean, there's a shooting every now and then, just like there's random shootings across the country, right? You know what I mean? But it's not like a regular problem of that type of violence. So, that's always a constant tension. Is even if you have a local ideal, and you have a lot of means, because Jim Rouse, the founder of Columbia, he was able to pull together millions of dollars and really do what he wants in a way that very few people ever could. But you still have to deal with the dynamic of being in a much larger society and all those tensions coming in. So, and again,
Yeah,
this
for me to,
go ahead.
yeah, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just want to note this report is 20 pages, right? So it just kind of touches a lot of these issues, but I just felt it was important because, like, people don't understand, across the country, people do look at developed communities and they point to Columbia, Maryland as one of the few examples of a successful planned community. So I think it does have some national repercussions of trying to understand what can even happen at the local level. And even with decent intentions and a lot of money, the challenges that occur.
So before I invite my colleagues to get in, I do want to ask one more thing specific to me selfishly, because your last comment was a little bit shocking to me because, again, as I often joke, I grew up in the hood of Columbia. All right. So when people talk about they didn't see black people on my street, outside of my mother and maybe one other person in the building, there were no whites. So I didn't see white folks at all until I went to school, or maybe, to the store or to, but on that little block, it's literally just one block.
What part of
Long
Columbia?
Reach, East Columbia, baby. Airy Brink Lane. You know what I'm saying? You heard? No, I'm just playing. But seriously, like, so I did want to ask, because I was trying to identify where Columbia found its, Long Reach situated itself. And even looking at some of what you were saying here about the schools and the demographics in the schools, I was trying to, like Long Reach High School didn't exist when I was a kid. So
yes.
the Howard High School was considered like the hood high school at that time, or one of them, because it had a relatively higher. So anyway, but I guess what I'm just asking is if there's anything, if you could just say anything about the current breakdown of demographically of Columbia in terms of, you said it a little bit in terms of the high schools, but where are these pockets of black and brown and so-called lower or relatively lower income folks?
Yeah, so like like you said, it's East Columbia, Wild Lake, Oakland Mills, Long Reach, and
Is that Hammond, right? Yeah.
And Hammond are majority black and Latino. What's interesting about Howard is I think people used to look down at Howard because it had a part of Columbia that really wasn't Columbia. It was more, particularly when we were younger, more white rural people, more lower income. They weren't part of Columbia. So people look down at that as more of like a kind of working class hick element with some black people. But as that place got developed and rich white people moved in that area, now Howard is one of the whitest schools. It's still not majority white, but it's 47% white, right? So it's interesting how race through gentrification can triumph that classism, right? Because the white area then became the some of the what do you call it, like trailer homes became single family homes, and now that's much more of an elite area.
Geechee, Diallo, anybody want to jump in? You got anything you want? You're muted, Diallo, and I did not do it, by the way, so you have to unmute yourself. I didn't mute you. I don't want to get accused again. People putting super chats in about how I'm abusing Diallo over here.
Yeah, okay. You know, shoot. Well, there's a lot, but just on some more specific targeted in terms of even with the segregation of schools, I've observed the phenomenon of Black students being segregated within desegregated spaces. And within schools, there's a term that some of the educators call, like some of the prominent schools that have, that are high rated, some of the best rated schools in the nation. Public schools are here in Chicago, and many Black parents fight to get their children into those schools. And then they find that their children are segregated within those schools, not being able to get into the honors classes, and literally have a totally different floors where they put them on. And it's apartheid segregated within a desegregated schools. And I also see that within communities where you talk about high income and planned communities where the affluent Blacks who live there are extremely isolated within those communities. So I mean, can you kind of speak to that, even when the demographics, the numbers, and the physical proximity is what it's supposed to be? Often the culture and the relationships don't play out the way they're theoretically supposed to play out in desegregated, more equitable, integrated spaces.
Well, and I think, and we didn't get into the depth of, like you said, like the segregation within the schools, right? Because and that was true when I was in school. Like, people thought Oakland Mills was a tough school. They thought it was majority Black, but maybe it was like 25% Black, 30% Black. But and would assume it's majority Black, but not understanding. Like, you go to classes. I remember they tried to move me to some GT class, and I was like, I'm the only Black kid in this class. I was like, forget that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not doing that, right? Because and you can become isolated. Like, they design you. I mean, it's just like, and it's America, right? Like, that's what they try to do with even the token representation they're going to bring in. They'll put you in a predominantly, all white space or elite space, and you're supposed to be separated from the other. So there is that issue. I think where Columbia was more successful, and to be fair, is I think in the 70s, there wasn't that type of radical phenomenon of, like, having super GT and then honors and then regular. It was much more, you had smart kids in classes, you had slower kids in classes, which were pretty much all in the same class. And I think really it's America's reaction to class and race integration about how do we hold up, how do we make sure my kids aren't in the same class as these slow kids aren't being slowed down, right? And so they created, even within a school where you go to the same school with them, you can have an elite, a removed experience. And I do think that's a serious challenge and goes against, because I mean, in the original Columbia schools too, they had this really open thing where it was like, we're not having separate classrooms. Like, they had like pods, like just open areas where kids, you could work at your own space, own pace, but be in one class. And so kids would move around from station to station. So I do think there was this kind of and helpful, ideal version of what could be. But I think the reality is many people don't want their kids with working class kids. They don't want their kids who aren't getting paid tutors every night to help them out. They only want their kids with them, and I think that's maybe the biggest challenge to Columbia and to the country is we act like we want some type of equity and equal opportunity, but we don't. We want to be elite in our own circles and keep other people out, and we keep bumping into that.
And I'm sorry. And it's, but the thing is, and another thing I see with this concept of desegregation and integration, with the failings and the many problems that have been born out of this desegregation and integration movement, it seems like the integrationists and the desegregationists keep offering more intensified, expanded integration and desegregation whenever we come up against the failings of this effort.
Sorry, if you could explain that a little bit, I'm not following you.
It seems like you have a failed policy, and when the policy, when the fallout of the failed policies manifest, it's all that is offered to us is more of the failed policy, intensified failed policy, a reworking of a failed policy, instead of abandoning the failed policies and offering something else.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the question is, what is the failed policy? particularly in the Columbia context. We could talk more broadly. And I'm trying to think of that guy's book. It was a white guy who wrote it, but he based it off of Stokely Carmichael saying around segregation. And moving away from Columbia, it was a good critique. It was based off of Stokely Carmichael's critique of the idea of how integration oftentimes mean deconstructing whatever Black spaces there were, and then allowing some Blacks to come into white spaces, and that, but never with this understanding of that, well, whites can also go into Black institutions, right? And he kind of deconstructed how during public school, you know, during the 40s and 50s, Blacks were the most educated teachers in the country because Blacks with masters and PhDs really couldn't do anything else. Like all you could, you know, there's a couple Black colleges you could teach at, and then you were a teacher. So you had a very elite teaching force. But with this idea of integration, it was like, okay, it wasn't we're going to send white kids into these Black schools. We're going to send Black kids into white schools, and we're not going to send their teachers because no one wants that Black teacher. So it like tore apart one of the stronger aspects of it. Still was a weak school system and that it wasn't funded and these types of things. So definitely, you know, whether you have integration, let me say, and segregation can be used to maintain elite and white supremacy. And I think that's too oftentimes what we see. But I do think it is an interesting dynamic. And what does it mean? I mean, and we'll see, I guess. But something that's different than when I was a youth is as there's less and less white people. That's one thing I didn't know. It is interesting, too, that whites are the only group that are leaving Columbia over like the last 20 years. Like I think there's like a decline of, I don't want to exaggerate, I think I want to say 100,000, but they've moved from 2000 from being 64% of the population to I think 46% of the population in 2020. So that is interesting that it might even be too integrated for white people to come here.
Well, that's why they started building River Hill and all that stuff. I mean, that to me, when I say my point about Columbia being the microcosm of the bigger world, we see, and we could literally see the white flight because River Hill is right there. Like, you can see that they didn't go that far. They're right there.
Can y'all share some of that white flight? Because if y'all running out of white folks, I got some in my hood I'd love to offer up to y'all because this gentrification shit is going crazy in my hood. So if y'all short on white folks, I'd be glad to offer up the white folks up the south side of Chicago. I tell them there's a Black community seeking white folks that wants them there.
But I think that River Hill phenomenon, which is one of the newest villages in Columbia, the control that the Rouse Company had on Columbia didn't allow for River Hills to be developed for a long time.
Right.
I think that's an important piece that I haven't noted. The market will bring back and intensify racial class segregation. The only, for whatever, you know, it wasn't as successful as we wanted to be. Whatever success Columbia had, it's because they had control and didn't allow private developers to come in and just build houses wherever they wanted, a whole bunch of single family homes. It takes a really strong control of resources to, if you just have a free market, it'll just be elites over here and everybody else left to fend for themselves. So I do think
and by the way,
something to
just to add, sorry about that, but River Hill has already had its nigger and monkey incidents, and you know the few Black students that are over there, they're getting it. So like it's.
Well, and also let's remember, and the students, like this isn't like integration of Boston in the 70s, where you're taking poor kids from the hood of Boston, which is a real hood, because Columbia hoods aren't really hoods. But like from the real hood and put it, come on now.
What was your block called, Jared? Your block,
Airy Brink Lane, aka Airy Bronx, Airy Brooklyn. You know what I mean?
Say the real one again. Airy Brink.
Airy Brink Lane.
Yeah.
No, you lost already.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever. Exactly. You don't know nothing about these.
But my point is that it's not taking like you know youth from kind of isolated, super low income areas. Yeah. It's taking African Americans who are in the top 20%, and probably live in River Hill, top 10 or 5%, the most elite African Americans, and they're getting it for not being elite enough, right? And like so,
You're still
it's
black.
crazy how deep it
It's
is.
still black though. That's the thing. I mean, and if you got there is no income that will overcome that, and that's why that whole River Hill thing. I mean, it's such, to me, on some level, I think it's beautiful that I can drive down there whenever I want, and I can see that white flight, and I can see the now, for those of us that have the Columbia gym membership, because like people, like you get a membership, a Columbia Association membership, and you get access to all the facilities. When I was swimming, the River Hill gym is the only heated pool in the whole joint. So I used to make sure I was in that thing 5 o'clock every morning, first one in the pool, because I see what they were doing. I saw what they were doing. Me, and you know who I would see there in the morning? For those who know this area of sports, David Dupree, the former basketball player and announcer. And so he was out there still rocking his little afro. You know what I mean? Yeah, you know what I'm saying? It's good for your back. Anyway, my bad. So, but you see it.
With a swimming pool and gym membership. You're the first hood with a swimming membership.
But
like I said, it's a microcosm. Obviously, it's not the hood, the real, but relatively speaking, but yeah, you get the gym membership. That's right.
But also too, like the hood is just where black people live, right? It's like everywhere, right? It's like, the cities, Baltimore, this great city, let's move there, get a job. That's where people go. And then once we get there in sufficient numbers, white people move out, resources move out, and then it's the hood. So it's not weird that Columbia would turn into the hood. It's not weird that, I don't know when Baltimore's doing this, but you're seeing more and more whites moving into what was inner cities. And you're seeing more and more of our poverty being pushed out into the suburbs. So we didn't talk about that in this paper, but that is something to note that when Columbia was created, so this idea that Columbia was a place to get away from poverty, from kind of the social issues or what have you. But now suburbs are really becoming the place where you're even having much more of low income. And Prince George's County is even a better example of that. That was like the high income black area, but by it being black, it allowed other blacks to move in, and now it has a lot more challenges around like low income. And also just one last thing about, but again, I don't know if I buy into your income can't buy you into whiteness. Your income and wealth, I might. It might. You know what I mean?
Even Henry Louis Gates had the police called on his funky self.
Oprah got kicked out of the store. Oprah got kicked out.
But that led to beer with the president.
Exactly.
It's not the same. Last time the police was in my face, last time I was in handcuffs, I didn't get no beer with the goddamn president. So,
but I'm just saying, obviously it's not the same across the board. I'm just saying in that moment though, they was like, nah.
No, like the racial inequality in that space is that an elite black professor is equal to a working class white cop. Right? Like that's crazy. That's the race balance, right? That a working class white cop is equal to this black professor, and they both get
not just the most elite black professor, maybe ever.
You're right. Corporate connected, all that stuff. You're 100% right. But
anyway,
but I
I'm
do
just
think,
saying,
and that is even when we talk about the high income in Columbia, and it's 96,000, which isn't balling. That still has much less wealth than whites who would be at 96,000, or whites who I think are more around 150, 160 median income. So yeah. Anyway, just pointing that out.
Anybody got something they want to bring up? Because there was a number of other things that I could there's plenty of things here that I thought were fascinating, including one point was that the reminder that we got Fort Meade and the NSA. When you were developing the context of Columbia, we got, Fort Meade, which is high, not just the Army, but does a lot of military intelligence. We got the NSA around here, the whole corridor. But there was one other piece. What was the one other thing that I wanted to raise for sure? And I'm just going through my notes here real quick.
Well, just
go ahead. Yeah.
I just put one thing that also does make Columbia successful, quote unquote, is it was a smart location, right? It was in between two major city areas and DC being this place of, jobs all related to the federal government, allowed for the, to be centered in a place of a growing economy, right? And that is, something that I think, is challenging for others to try to replicate. Like, well, what does it mean to try to grow a community in a city that is located in a down economy, Detroit, where the whole state is not doing well? Like, what are the, and I think one thing is, the founder, Rouse, is very clear that his first goal was to make a profit. And I think this highlights the limitations of for-profit development. Like, at best, I think you can do something like Columbia, where Columbia always, the median income was higher than the national income. And it was always a place for, upper middle class and high income people. And maybe there we could be racially integrated. But I haven't seen the society that's really bringing together, low income, middle income, and high income, and is designed to do so. And you will only do that with really government subsidized low income housing, because there is no real private market that serves low income people.
So because I got to jump off here, I'm gonna do something really trifling, and I want to raise this issue I wanted to raise, and then I'm gonna have to listen to it while I'm in this virtual doctor's appointment. Because this issue of integration and segregation, I think is fascinating, and there's a little bit of nuance here that I thought that you all pull out that was really interesting. So as you say here, while the Black population of Columbia is less evenly distributed relative to the white population, and isolation has increased, the exposure of Black and white people to each other has deteriorated more drastically than the other two integration metrics. Exposure is a measure of the level of potential contact between minorities and the majority group in the places where they live. In the case of Columbia, there have been diminishing levels of exposure for Black and white residents, indicating that the groups are less likely to interact with each other than they were 4 decades ago. This intensifying pattern of segregation was identified for Howard County as a whole, and for Columbia in particular, over 20 years ago. A 2011 analysis of impediments to fair housing choice cites village design as a key factor in creeping economic and racial segregation of Columbia. Older villages adhere to Rouse's principles of economic and racial integration. Consequently, Harper's Choice, Owen Brown, Wild Lake, Oakland Mills, and Long Reach were developed with greater concentrations of affordable housing. River Hill was not developed until the 1990s and contains few multifamily units and virtually no affordable housing. So one, this multifamily unit phrase as opposed to apartments, I always think is fascinating. But this point specifically about integration is, I was trying to wrap my mind around it, and I admit I struggle a little bit conceptually. But you're talking about Black people being more dispersed throughout Columbia. And even while this is happening, interaction with whites still is decreasing.
What's up? And part of that's natural, right? Like, if you're only 8% of the population and you're not all concentrated in one area, you're going to be bumping into white people all the time, right? Like, because original Columbia was set up to kind of have low income, median, well, not even so much low income, but apartments, townhomes, single family homes all throughout. So if Blacks are 8%, we're all spread out, we're bumping into everybody. As the Black population grows, and as it's more clear that the older villages are the more affordable villages, that's more and more where Blacks are concentrating. I'm not as focused about, hey, Blacks need to bump into white people a whole bunch to have a positive society. I think kind of the most important aspect strategically around integration is that when you put higher income, middle income, and lower income people together in the same schools, those schools are more politically protected. When it's just considered a low income school, it's not politically protected because the high income people run things. I think like that's the main reason to try to have a more integrated society. And I think the strongest part of Columbia was that there was some buy-in for a while into the public schools, the Columbia Association gym that everybody could go to, or most people would go to, the the bike paths that everybody could use. Having public land that everybody buys into provides more opportunity. Then now, as we see more and more private swimming facilities, private gyms, and so who cares about what's for the public? Because the elite now have their own spot to go. So I think that's strategically where integration can be helpful.
Right. So I was joking with Jared about Calvin Ball being his cousin, Howard's county executive, but
Uh-huh.
how has the people in office or even Calvin engage this work, this research, any kind of traction with anybody in any of the offices with this work so far?
Well, it just came out a couple of days ago. There is a lot of, as everywhere, there's politics within Colombia. There is those who feel that, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, how much local politics is run by developers and by developer money. And that is interesting, like how dominant a force that is. And I do think this report can bump into some of that politics because what Colombia has been pried open more and more for private developers, which then allow for just greater segregation, kind of greater, even more elite than Colombia was before. So I do think this will play out. There's also the thing called the Colombia Association, which is supposed to be running Colombia, and there's been a lot of politics there about um, they use the words diversity a lot because it's all white and it's mostly all old people, but white people are young at other white people about not being diverse, but it's still all white, right? And so, but I think a really key issue is how much focus and how much even is there buying in Colombia to having this idea of we're going to have a multi-class, multi-race thing. Because I think nowadays people might think of multi-race as meaning, well, look, I have someone from India who lives over here. I have someone from somewhere else over there, and that's all I care about, multiracial integration. When in the 60s, there was an idea that there was a class component to integration, that you had to do economic change for integration. And I think that is not part of the consciousness of many people in the suburb.
And I know this is probably off topic. Any hopes or thoughts about Wes Moore getting in office? Any
No,
positive
no,
vibes?
yeah, no, it is interesting, and I think that's part of Maryland, right? About how Maryland has a much larger black population than many people realize, and Columbia is part of that. And it's interesting to see how you first had Ben Jealous running 4 years ago, I believe, as the outside nonprofit black guy who foundations like, and could he be the first black governor, even though he had no experience in local politics in Maryland, though while running the NAACP, he did do a lot of advocacy things. And I think actually he was rejected by the Democratic establishment, right? Like they totally, because he endorsed Bernie, right? It wasn't like a super black radical thing, but he was much more the Bernie wing of the party. They were like, this guy's not listening to us. He's not part of the machine. And so when he ran, he didn't get much support. Wes Moore kind of followed up, and I know they're friendly with each other. As I'm not going to be outside the Democratic establishment. I'm just an outside. I'm more like an Obama guy. I'm someone who people don't know is part of the Democratic establishment, but I can come in and represent you all well, right? So I do think probably Wes Moore will be better than Hogan, but I don't know how much that's saying, right? I mean, people loved Hogan, but Hogan was horrible to Baltimore and to doing things that might really redistribute resources, particularly to lower income black communities. I think Wes Moore will be a bit better than that, but he doesn't have a strong grassroots base to really change politics in Maryland, at least from what I can tell.
So down to a simplification or a more rooted conclusions. Is segregation a symptom or is it a problem unto itself?
I mean, I would say, to me, the problem is white supremacy and segregation. White supremacy segregation is a symptom of that. The idea that just some people might buy into a liberal notion that segregation, and it gets to what you mean by segregation. Like, I don't consider a group of people living in one area because they want to segregation. Like Native Americans live in a particular area. I don't think that's I think segregation is when you have political and economic structures that only allow some groups in privileged positions and keep others in disenfranchised positions. That to me, that idea of segregation yes, I'm against, we should deconstruct, but I don't just kind of have this like, oh, it's about making sure you have enough friends of different races or cultures or things. Like that's not really where I come from looking at segregation.
So in concluding that, so I actually agree that it's more about, equitable distribution of resources
Yes.
and just distribution of power and influence within institutions that control people's lives. So with that, it's not really about proximity to white people. I really appreciate you stating that, because I think more of our community needs to more so grasp that, because I think too many of our people think proximity to white people is power. Proximity to white people is evidence of black advancement or black elevation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no. And I think throughout, you know what I mean? If people study the history, a lot of the efforts around integration was more to get access to resources than it was just to sit, you know, just to be around white people. I mean, there are very few serious black activists who I think their main thing was, oh, including Martin Luther King and people who represented integration. They were much more about providing greater resources than this idea. And I always find that interesting because, Martin Luther King was very clearly part of a black organization and black institutions, right? He wasn't just trying to always make sure, well, the country's 70% white, so I want my organization to be 70% white. That wasn't the focus.
But that was what made him popular. If you look at Dr. Amos Wilson's critique and at Claude Anderson's critique, that the reason why Dr. King resonated with and became so prominent in the imaginations of black people was not so much in being remembered for his labor struggles and his economic cause for economic justice, but that promise that little black boys and little black girls can walk in hand with little white girls and little white boys. That was a misinterpretation that too many individuals in our community have run with. I
Yes,
mean,
and it's because this is always a challenge, right? When you have to sell your message to a white elite who you're actually in many ways in opposition to, and when when your black people are getting most of their news and understanding what's good through the white elites, right? So what resonates with white elites is what they put on the news, what they sell as who you are, and which the masses of people oftentimes buy into. I would say early Martin Luther King, very early Montgomery bus boycott, I think it was much more people respected. He was standing up to a racist system because they saw him, they saw what he was dealing with. And once you start getting into national media and these types of things, it's very hard to get your, let's say, a critical voice of white supremacy, even white supremacy and liberalism, through a white supremacist liberal media outlet, right? Like I think that's the challenge that we deal with, and and you're right, and many people falling victim to the kind of white liberal whitewashing of Dr. King that's been happening for the last 60 years, and happened while he was alive, right? And happened while he was alive, and it's even happened with Malcolm X. Like I always remember, what was it, '93 or something like that, when Bill Clinton was jogging around the White House with an X hat, like a Malcolm X hat. And I was like, in '92, '93, Malcolm was still considered radical in a lot of schools. I remember in Columbia, there was a deal at one of the schools that the black kids would stop wearing Malcolm X shirts and the white kids would stop wearing Confederate flags. And I was like, y'all accepting that as a deal? But there was still this radicalness of Malcolm X. But again, Bill Clinton, and many others will take Malcolm X and say, well, he was an integrationist at the end. And, and that's why we should all love Malcolm, because he grew up to believe that all people, regardless of skin color, they'll always take that liberal frame and put that on our leaders whenever they're ready to accept them and recognize them.
All right. You have all right. So I'll keep. So in you had stated that you are advocating for Columbia's leaders to return or reinstitute the founding principles, if I read that correctly.
Well, I'm trying to subtly push. They need to do more than that, right? Like that one, they've moved away from the founding principles, but even the founding principles weren't focused on really bringing in and having a space for low-income people, right? Even early
Right. That's why I
Columbia,
thought it was kind of
yeah.
curious that you were saying that they need to return to.
Well, yeah, and so I think that what's happened is there was that weakness, and I'm trying to note that in the original Columbia, and then it got worse, right? And now we're even a much worse path where we don't even want like somewhat middle high income people. We want houses that are $700,000 in value as the median in our newest village. Like like I'm trying to highlight how distant we are even from that Rouse vision, and how even that Rouse vision had weaknesses, and that we would really need to, do a lot to change that. Now, between us, I don't believe there is a strong will in Columbia, Maryland. So many people who have moved here didn't even move here for the Rouse vision. They moved here to be part of an elite suburb, and so that's what they want. So I don't know politically where the power would come from to actually go for my more radical vision of what would community economic development be, that really doesn't try to that really tries to include median income of Americans, right? Of white Americans, 70,000, Black Americans, 40,000, but also includes low income and has a functioning society, and I think that's a big problem with the country, is I don't think there is actually a will for that. And Dr. King always talked about that, right? We have the resources to address these problems. We don't have the will. And I still think that is the challenge, even in liberal Columbia.
Yeah, that actually was one of my questions. I took it away though, but it was definitely that idea of I guess still speaking to class in your work. And I wonder if there's ever a time. Earlier we was talking about anarchism, and we talk about communism and socialism, but I wonder if there's ever a time where in your work or other economists' work they kind of advocate for maybe that radical push of no class, or not to kind of even acknowledge a lower class versus a middle class.
Well, I think part of the challenge, particularly in this field of community economic development, is that you're focused on what you're trying to develop in this market dominated space, right? So the idea that you're going to create a no class community in a system, and with developers that are, all make their money off kind of class differences, is very challenging. One thing I bring up, there was a planned community called Soul City they were trying to develop in North Carolina. And they actually talked to Jim Rouse, the founder of Columbia, and we're trying to use some of these ideas. But I think there you see a difference. There you saw a Black activist, and you can critique, there's plenty of critiques for Black activists doing Soul City. Yeah. But the power and resources they could garner versus what someone like Jim Rouse can, in that Soul City was never developed, right? It was never created. It was, it never got far beyond kind of the sketches. While
it's
Columbia, what'd you say?
It's a prison now.
Oh, that area. Yeah. And Columbia's 55 years later is considered one of the top cities in the country, one of the most safe cities in the country, or what have you. So even when you have kind of Black liberal reformists trying to have something for Black people, I think the economics and politics of it hasn't allowed one type of successful community economic development space that Columbia has, that Columbia is. Yeah.
So Jarek, we were just trying to figure out how to get Bootsy to move down to Columbia, Maryland, and start our own economy.
Our own economy. You introduced DJ.
Yeah, I'm gonna connect Bootsy and Deidre and see if we can do that.
But hey, but I will say one positive thing. I think I do think about Columbia, and a takeaway is that there was a lot of infrastructure built, and so it did allow for low-income people to utilize these in ways. Like when my family became very poor, we still had access. Like, you might be segregated somewhat in the classes, but still the schools were better than a lot of other schools, right? Like at all levels, you still had access to like this walking park. This walking path system and things like that. Like there are some positive, and I think that is why it's so important to have a strong public sphere, particularly in our limited kind of socioeconomic situation. That one of the things we can do is fight for the strongest public sphere spaces that really are open to all. And this is a whole separate thing that's not in the report, but always, even in the public spaces, it was always real clear to me that when they have artistic events and these types of things, they weren't having things that would bring in a lot of African Americans are excite, bringing blacks from Baltimore. It's always kind of, very white, like the wine festival. That's actually started to become black over
No,
time.
we get every year, because Meriwether Post Pavilion is right in the heart of Columbia, the main venue for art and music performance. Every year we get the jazz festival at the beginning of the summer, and then we get the August end of the summer Soul Summer Fest, or whatever they call it, where all the black artists come out, and everything in between and everything else is pretty much white mainstream stuff.
Which was a pretty big change, though. Which was a pretty big change from when we were youth. Like you didn't even get that. Like you weren't having jazz events. It's only become understanding now that we can, have jazz for black people if it's for, really bougie 50 and older. You know what I mean? Like, type. So
yeah, and they'll bring and they always have a go-go band as part of that Soul Summer Fest. So that's always a good thing too. Anyway, appreciate you all. Let me jump out real quick and had this virtual doctor's appointment, which is, good thing I got some health care. Shout out to healthcare.
Pears.
Anyway.
Shout out to pears.
So since both of y'all are Howard County products, what, in the spirit of Black History Month, what would be the Black history of Howard County that you will share, or that you would encourage people to learn about?
Oh, Harriet Tubman Lane is right down the street. Harriet Tubman's, Underground Railroad came through here. They got and there's a DJ, I don't even know anything about this. There's a Freedom School around the corner over here. Well, not over here, but on not far from Harriet Tubman Lane.
Well, yeah, like there is this Black history pre-Columbia creation. I do find it fascinating, that you have one of, the nation's most important Black radicals that's part of a Black media collective out in Columbia. Dr. Jared Ball. I'm always amazed at that Columbia produced.
Me and Diedrich, you and Aaron Magruder paving the way. I did think that was funny. I didn't know you two were actually classmates. You dropped that in the.
I used to call him Farrakhan. We were Black Studies together. I used to call him because he's light skinned. He has glasses, and I was known. My Black radical, the white mom, was known as the Black radical of the school, right? And so people would talk to me about things and what have you. So yeah, me and Aaron did go back. But what's interesting is where I live right now. I didn't even know this growing up. This is a slave plantation. Like the slave master's house is right up there. Oakland Mills High School, I didn't know this when I went there. That was the mill for the slave plantation. That is where I live now, in the slave master's house up here. And I find it crazy how Black people are having their weddings up in the slave master's house all the time, thinking this is a place to do the electric slide. I'm like, what are we doing?
Hey, well, Blandair Park, they built that new athletic complex, and they have the little signpost in the middle, talk about Blandair Park, and it's that whole area was included some housing for enslaved Africans and stuff like that. So there is. I mean, this is Maryland. It's the United States. It's Maryland. So there's bound to be a whole bunch of horrific nightmare. Howard County is named after the British Lord Howard or whatever, another slave owner. What else? There was more, but so yeah, anyway, anyway, it's not the same Howard as Howard University, by the way. It's the British slave owner as opposed to the defender of Southern education.
I thought y'all was gonna say one of y'all was Jay-Z's connect in Maryland. He came to handle some work.
For a few years. See, again, people always glorify one end of that trade. For a few years, I would have been one of his customers in this area, or one of his employees. Customers.
Oh, okay. I know what you're talking about. I'm just catching up. Okay, I didn't know Jason came down here.
Some of us was over there hanging out behind the Wawa lady. That late night Wawa hangout. Anyway,
all right. Well, I appreciate you guys letting me come talk about.
No, DJ, anytime, man. Appreciate you, man. No, thanks for doing this work, man, and for letting us know about it, and continued good work, and happy Black History Month. Congratulations. Now, thanks again,
Yeah.
DJ. Appreciate you,
All
man.
right, thanks,
All right, take
guys.
it easy.